For centuries, the most powerful men in Europe controlled everything: the land, the food, the people. But then something terrible happened. Half the workforce were wiped out almost overnight, death on a scale never seen before. However, the people left standing realized they had something valuable, and that realization rewired who held power in society itself. But what if today, the real danger isn't collapse, but a system that never gets the chance to change? Hey people, welcome back. If you're new here, I'm Michael. I have a degree in ancient history, and on this channel, we discuss the recurring patterns that shape and shatter civilizations. Let's get into it. It's the early 14th century, and Europe runs on land. But not the land the way we think of it now, as property, as investment, as something you can buy and sell at will. No. Land in medieval Europe is the entire basis of civilization. It determines your food supply, your military capacity, your political authority. It determines whether your children eat. Literally everything flows from it, and the entire social order, the church, the law, the military, the economy, has organized itself around one central question: who controls the land and who works it? And the answer for 400 years has been the same. The lord controls it, the peasant works it. You were born into your place and you died in it. The system was airtight. Yet that arrangement persisted not because anyone chose it, but because the system made it structurally impossible to do otherwise. The serf is born tied to an estate. He owes his lord a fixed number of days of labour every single week, not as a favour, not as a wage, but as a legal obligation he inherited at birth. He cannot leave without permission. He cannot appeal to a higher court. He cannot walk to the next village and offer his work to someone who might pay him for it. The law forbids it. And even when the law is imperfect, the reality enforces itself. And this worked because there were always more peasants than the lords needed. Labour is abundant, which means labour is cheap, which means the man breaking his back in someone else's field has no leverage, no alternatives, and no exit. The system doesn't need constant enforcement, it just needs one condition to remain permanently true: more workers than work. But that condition was about to collapse in the most horrific way possible. In October 1347, the Black Death reaches Sicily, carried on Genoese trading ships. From the Crimean port of Caffa, the sailors who arrive are already dying, and within weeks, the disease is spreading through Messina. Within months, it is across Italy, through Naples, Rome, Florence, Venice. By the following summer, it had crossed the Alps into France and Germany, and by 1349 it was in England, Scandinavia, and in Poland. But the speed is not even the most destabilizing thing about it. It is the randomness. It strikes the old and the young, the wealthy and the destitute, the devout and the sinful, with no apparent pattern and no apparent logic. Entire households die within days of each other. Villages hold funerals until there is no one left to dig the graves. Monasteries, places built around the idea of communal living, of shared prayer and shared meals, become death traps, the contagion moving through them like fire through dry wood. Now the mortality estimates vary, because the record keeping of the era was patchy even before the plague destroyed the people doing the record keeping. But historians broadly agree, somewhere between 30 and 50% of Europe's entire population died within 5 years. Just 5 years. In some regions it was higher. Parts of France lost 2/3 of their population. Some English villages simply ceased to exist. Can you imagine just how devastating that must have been? But here is what those numbers actually meant for the system. When the dying stopped, the lord still had his land, he still had his title, he still had the centuries of legal precedent that said he was in charge, he still had the courts, the obligations, the church telling peasants this was the natural order. But what he no longer had was enough people to work the fields. For the first time in 400 years, there were more estates than labourers to run them. Lords who had never needed to think about the well-being of their workers were suddenly watching their fields go unplanted, crops literally rotting in the ground, animals untended, harvests failing not because of drought or disease in the soil, but simply because there was nobody left to bring them in. And the people who had survived, they were beginning to understand something something that would have been almost unthinkable a decade earlier. They were needed.
Now, what happened next was not a revolution. There were no slogans, no ideology, no organised movement with demands and a programme. Instead, it was more mechanical than that, more quiet, but in some ways more radical.
Peasants started leaving. Not everywhere at once, not dramatically, but a man who had been bound to one estate his entire life looked around, calculated, consciously or not, that the old enforcement mechanisms were stretched thin, that the Lord needed him more than he needed the Lord, and so he walked to the next village, to a market town, to an estate where a desperate lord was quietly, illegally, offering better terms to anyone willing to show up and work. But this created something the ruling class had never experienced before, something they had no framework for and no good response to: competition for labour. Wages began rising across England, France, and much of Western Europe, not all at once, not uniformly, but persistently. In some areas, agricultural wages doubled within a generation. In others, lords began offering reduced obligations, better food, more freedoms, anything to keep their workforce from drifting to the next estate. Lords who had inherited a world where labour simply existed, abundant and docile, found themselves in an entirely unfamiliar situation. They were negotiating with peasants, and they were losing.
So what was the response from the ruling class? Well, when it came, it was swift and revealing.
In 1351, just 3 years after the plague reached England, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers. The law attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It made it illegal for workers to demand higher pay, illegal for lords to offer it, illegal for peasants to leave their home estate in search of better conditions elsewhere. Justices of the peace were given new powers to enforce it. Fines were levied. Men were imprisoned. On paper, it looked like a reassertion of control. But think carefully about what it actually means when the ruling class has to pass a law to stop wages rising. It means wages were already rising. It means the old structural mechanisms, the ones that had enforced compliance for 4 centuries without any legislation at all, had already failed. You don't pass a law against something that isn't happening. You don't build a dam in front of water that isn't moving. Thus, the Statute of Labourers is not evidence that the system was holding. It is evidence that the system had cracked, and that the people at the top were desperate enough to admit it in writing.
This is the thing about power that the medieval world understood instinctively, and that we keep having to relearn.
Power isn't moral. It isn't given by God or inherited with virtue, or deserved by the good. It is structural. It flows toward whoever controls the thing that other people need. And when that thing changes, when abundance becomes scarcity or scarcity becomes abundance, power moves. Not because anyone decided it should, but because the underlying structure demands it. And for so long the scarce thing was land. The Lord had it, so the Lord had power. Yet suddenly, the scarce thing was now the peasant, and the peasant, slowly, terrifyingly for those who watched from above, was beginning to act like it.
But systems don't surrender quietly. They never do.
The decades that followed were not a smooth transition to something better. They were a grinding, violent, bitterly contested struggle between a class that was losing power and a class that was gaining it, and neither side even entirely understood what was happening or why. Lords tried to enforce old obligations by physical force. Manorial courts handed down rulings that reimposed serfdom on men who had effectively been free for years. Local officials cracked down hard on movement, on wage negotiation, on anything that looked like the old order slipping. The church reinforced the message from the pulpit. The hierarchy was divine, that obedience was virtue, that to want more than God had given you was a form of sin, and for a while it looks like it might hold.
But the pressure kept building beneath the surface, and in 1381 it broke open entirely.
The Peasants Revolt began with a tax, a poll tax, levied on every adult regardless of income, designed to fund a war in France that most ordinary people had no stake in and no interest in. It was nakedly unfair. It hit the poor the hardest, and after 30 years of rising expectations, rising wages, rising confidence, and then repeated attempts by the state to claw it all back, it was the spark that lit everything. Peasants across Essex and Kent marched on London, tens of thousands of them. They burned court records, specifically the documents that encoded their obligations, their status, and their bondage. They stormed the Tower of London. They seized and executed the Lord Chancellor. For a brief, astonishing moment, they even forced the young King Richard II to ride out and meet them, to listen, to make promises, for the abolition of serfdom, for fixed rent, for general pardon. But then the revolt was crushed within weeks. The promises were revoked the moment Richard had the military strength to revoke them. The leaders were tracked down and executed. The king reportedly told the surviving rebels that serfs they were and serfs they would remain. However, the ground had shifted in ways no proclamation could reverse.
Now, what followed happened over generations, not just years. Too slow to feel like transformation to the people living through it, but unmistakable in retrospect.
Serfdom declined across England through the 15th century, not through a single law or a single act of will, but through the slow economic impossibility of maintaining it. You cannot compel tied labour indefinitely when that labour has alternatives. When the man you're trying to bind can leave, and someone somewhere else will employ him, the compulsion eventually collapses. Lords began accepting rent payments instead of labour obligations. Fixed wages replaced feudal service. The manor, as an economic unit, began to dissolve. Trade expanded. Towns grew. A new class emerged: merchants, lawyers, financiers, who derived their wealth not from land but from commerce, and with them came a new political reality. The English Parliament, which had existed before the plague, but as a relatively minor institution, grew steadily more powerful. The reason was fiscal. The crown needed money, wars were expensive, and the old feudal mechanisms for raising revenue, calling on lords to provide knights and supplies, were increasingly inadequate. And taxation, the alternative, required consent. Specifically, it required the consent of the people wealthy enough to be worth taxing. That consent was negotiated in Parliament.
Wealth was now talking to power and insisting on a seat at the table.
That logic, followed through over the next 2 centuries, would culminate in the constitutional crises of the 17th century, the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the Bill of Rights, the foundations of what we now call parliamentary democracy. Yet nobody designed this, nobody planned it. It emerged, imperfectly and violently, from the ruins of a system that had become impossible to sustain.
So here's the pattern, because there is one, and it matters.
Every stable system rests on the distribution of a key resource: land, energy, labour, information. When that distribution holds, the system holds. The people who control the scarce resource stay in control. Power is self-reinforcing, self-perpetuating. The structure reproduces itself without anyone having to think about it. But when the distribution breaks, when the abundant thing becomes scarce, or the scarce thing suddenly becomes available to everyone, the logic of the system breaks with it. Power doesn't disappear, it reallocates, not toward the people who deserve it, not toward the people who need it most, toward whoever now controls what everyone else needs. Thus, the Black Death didn't liberate anyone by moral argument. It didn't convince lords that peasants deserve better. No, it just made the old arrangement mathematically unsustainable, and then stood back while 4 centuries of accumulated structure slowly ground itself apart. This was not a moral story, it was a structural one.
Now you might be thinking, Michael, that's all very interesting, but what is the relevance of this to the modern day? Well, here is why that distinction matters right now.
Across much of the developed world, something structurally familiar is beginning to build. Populations are aging. Birth rates have fallen below replacement levels in Japan, South Korea, across Southern Europe, and across large parts of the United States and Northern Europe. The ratio of working-age people to retirees is shifting, slowly, quietly, but persistently, in ways that create exactly the kind of underlying labour scarcity the Black Death produced by catastrophe. Not at the same speed, not with the same violence, but the structural pressure is recognisable. But we respond to it in ways that would have been completely unimaginable to a medieval lord watching his workforce walk away. When labour markets tighten, we adjust immigration policy to expand the supply of workers. When wages rise faster than capital is comfortable with, we use monetary policy, trade liberalisation, and automation investment to counteract the pressure. When populations shrink, we deploy technology to substitute for human labour entirely. We have built entire institutions whose function is, in significant part, to prevent the kind of structural rupture that the Black Death caused by accident. And we are extraordinarily good at it. The shocks that once cracked civilizations are now absorbed, managed, smoothed out, before they can cascade into something uncontrollable.
But the Black Death forces you to ask a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer.
The transformation that followed the plague, the collapse of serfdom, the rise of wage labour and the growth of parliamentary power, was the slow emergence of something genuinely new. And none of it was designed, none of it was intended. It happened because the system broke, and something different had to grow in the gap. Yet you'd be hard-pressed to argue it wasn't a good thing. The rupture was not a tragedy that delayed progress. The rupture was the mechanism of progress.
But we are now, by design, very good at preventing the rupture, through some of the measures that I just outlined.
So what if the stability we've built is not resilience, but rigidity that happens to be holding for now? What if the tools we use to absorb structural pressure are the same tools that prevent structural transformation? We face pressures today, demographic, technological, ecological, that may be as fundamental as anything the medieval world confronted. But we are responding, as we always do now, by stabilising, by managing, by keeping the walls up. Now, the plague didn't immediately create democracy, but it did make the old world unsustainable, and from that unsustainability, across generations, violently, accidentally, without anyone quite understanding what they were building, something new, something different and something better emerged. So, are we more resilient than the medieval world? Or are we just better at holding the pressure in, while it quietly, invisibly, keeps building on the other side? Well, the answer, when it finally arrives, won't come as a philosophical argument. It never does. And perhaps that's something to be wary of.
Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, a comment, or subscribing to my channel down below. I'll see you next time.